Okay, so as you guys heard, as Thirimini said, and as I'm sure you guys have heard through Yachan's announcing for very long now, the theme is navigating modernity with ancient wisdom, right? And the Bible verse that they chose to take was Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. So like Thirimini said, what does that even mean, right? Navigating modernity with ancient wisdom. We can start with modernity, right? Not maternity, but modernity. What does modernity mean? Do you guys know what maternity means? Yeah, girls, yeah, you guys know. Okay, guys, you know too? Okay, not maternity, but what's modernity? We can start there. Feel free to talk, guys. Modern. So the root of the word, you obviously can see modern. So when you think of modern, that's a good place to start.
Sorry, we have one more.
No problem. Hi. Anyway. So modern. What comes to mind? Anyone?
Something that we do like currently rather than like in the past or thinking about what we do in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we do like in the days now.
Okay, that's good. Anyone else? Those are all right answers. Anyone else? Anything else that comes to mind either when you hear the word modernity or when you hear this topic in general? Nothing? So one example of modernity, I'm sure if you guys have heard, is like the rise of science, right? The rise of rational thought, right? As well as individualism, right? Especially in this year, 2024, individualism is a huge thing that's happening, which they always tell you guys, like, embrace your identity, figure out your identity, live who you are. You hear all these slogans, right? These are things that I'm sure all of you guys have heard before, right? Does modernity necessarily have to be a bad thing, right? We talked about things that are currently happening that weren't happening before, right? So what are some examples of modern advancements or things that are useful of modernity? Medicine. That's a great example. Like technology, right? Anyone else? Those are both like top two examples, especially with medicine, right? For you guys who don't know, in the 1700s and before industrialization and modernization, the statistics for a woman going into labor and the death rate was significantly higher, right? It's like significantly high because we didn't have the medical advancements to make sure that the mother was being taken care of healthy, especially during the labor itself, right? During childbirth. But especially nowadays, due to technology, due to different types of research and advancements, we've come to a place where statistically mothers have a very high chance of surviving childbirth, right? That's just one example, right? Another example, this laptop, my iPad, phones, right? We all use phones and they're all very useful, right? But they can also be something that's not as good, right? When you can think about, you can have a seat anyway, wherever you like. So when we talk about this concept of like a phone, for example, right? What's an example of when you could use your phone and it could be life-saving? In an emergency situation, right? Yeah, I don't know how people in the past would, call an ambulance to come with you if you don't have a phone, right? You gotta run home, get that phone from there, and then, or if you don't even have a phone, you run to the hospital, right? You realize that we're in a lot better place because of some technological advancements, right? So no, modernity or modernization is not in and of itself bad, right? And a biblical example of this is St. Paul, right? Do you guys know what St. Paul is really well known for? You have the apostles who kind of preached to the Jewish community, and who did St. Paul preach to?
Gentiles.
Nice, awesome. St. Paul preached to the Gentiles, right? So what is like the background of the Gentile people? Do you guys know the difference between the Jewish people and the Gentile people?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for being honest. So you had the Jewish people who were you have this promise from Abraham, right? God makes a promise to Abraham, and you have the entire Old Testament that takes place, right? We're not going to go through the whole Old Testament, but you guys know, right? From Abraham, a promise is made that you'll have many descendants, and then you have the cycle of events where God is constantly talking to people. You have the prophets, you have God talking to King David, and he tells him a plan to build a temple. King Solomon builds the temple, right? You guys are aware of these stories, right? So these Jewish people understand who God is a little bit, right? They have an understanding of how God has revealed himself through the prophets. But on the other side, you have the Gentiles, which is basically everybody else, right? So in the time period that Christ was living, what government was the Jewish people subject to? the Roman people, right? And do you guys know what language the Gospels were first written in?
Syria?
No, good guess. Good guess.
Latin.
Good guess. It's an ancient language. Good guess. It might be somewhere on here in like a slight, not the exact word, but a root of it. Greek, right? So you have what's known as the Greco-Roman world. Have you guys ever heard that phrase before in history class or anything? So you have the Greco-Roman world, right? Which is, as you guys know, the Roman Empire is one of the greatest empires that the world has ever seen, right? It took over pretty much all of Europe. So you have this Greco-Roman world, and then you have this guy Paul, who's a Jewish guy. And the Jewish people are very limited in everything that they do, right? They have a very strict regiment of life. But even though Paul is a Jew, he goes out to the Greco-Roman world to preach the gospel. Does that make sense? So he goes outside of the people who understand that they're supposed to be a Messiah. He's just going to anyone and everyone to preach the gospel to them, right? In doing so, Paul uses adaptability, right? Have you guys heard of philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato? Have you guys heard of these names before in school? So most of these Gentiles are familiar with people like that. They've read writings from all these other philosophers. So the way that Paul kind of reaches them, and if you guys if you ever care to do like a very in-depth study of Paul's epistles, you can see the same style of writing that Aristotle and Plato use in Paul's writings. Does that make sense? Because they wouldn't really understand the biblical prophecies if he starts talking about Isaiah said this, Ezekiel said this is who Jesus Christ is. So instead of doing that, he preaches the gospel in a way that is understandable to them without changing the gospel. That's the important part, right? He doesn't change the gospel message. The gospel that St. Paul preaches and the gospel that St. Thomas or St. Peter or whichever other apostle preach is not a different gospel, right? But he's using the modern world in terms of philosophy to reach those people. Does that make sense? So that's a biblical example of someone using modernity in an example of preaching the gospel for something that's good, right? But again, going back to the theme, navigating modernity, right? So Paul, would you say he was able to navigate modernity in a good way?
Yeah.
He didn't stray from the gospel. He didn't start preaching heresy. He didn't start believing what people like Aristotle or Plato said. He stood true to what Christ said, but he navigated it in a way using the tradition of the faith to preach the gospel properly. So again, navigating modernity with ancient wisdom, we can pose this question: who are we supposed to be? Right? That the question of why do you need to navigate modernity with ancient wisdom? It goes down to who are we supposed to be? Right? Why does it even matter? Right? So if you guys have paper and pen, you can write. If you have your phone, you can put it in your notes. If you want to just think about it, think about this question: who are we supposed to be? If someone asked you, who are you? Think about 5 things that you that you would identify as this is Solomon Jacob, right? We did introductions. You guys all said something interesting, something fun about you guys. So take a minute or two. If you guys need to discuss. But think about what makes you who, or the question of who are we supposed to be? And again, why does that even matter, right? So go ahead, think about that. You guys take a minute, talk about it if you need to.
That's what we're supposed to do.
You guys have your answers? Yeah? You guys ready to come back to the group table discussion? Good, you guys have your thoughts, your answers? Who are we supposed to be, or why does it even matter, right? When I asked who are you, you identified your name, right? You said your name, and the prompt I gave you was say your age or the year of school you're in. So those are things that make you who you are. Age is something that makes you who you are. What are some other things you guys thought of?
I like doing art.
Art. So some things that you do identify you as a person, okay? Anyone else? If someone asks, who are you?
Ethnicity.
Ethnicity, that's a huge one, right? Our cultural identity, right? It's even in the title of our churches, right? Indian Orthodox. What else? It's not a trick question. You guys can say whatever, and it's a good answer.
Our religion.
Our religion, great answer.
Our faith.
Faith, yeah. Nothing else? So you guys know there's many different things that we can identify ourselves with. Did anyone identify themselves as a human being? Did anyone? In your discussions, either in your mind or in the conversation to your neighbor, did any of you guys say, I am a human being? No, right? I would assume no, right? But if I showed you this picture, what comes to mind? Think about it, don't say anything, like 20 seconds, just look at this picture, and if you saw this on, a billboard, if you saw this on the screen, what comes to your mind, okay? Okay, who thinks they have the right answer? If you saw this and I'm asking you, what is this? What would you guys say?
A diagram of the human body.
A diagram of the human body. Do you think that this is always what the diagram of the human body look like?
No.
No, right? So, like you guys, who knows their medicine? Can anyone name all these organs and body parts?
Liver, kidney,
lungs,
liver,
kidney,
intestines,
stomach.
That's the ear. Oh, that's over there is the ear. On the left is the ear.
That's 2 kidneys.
This one is
That's a
heart.
Brain.
Right? So these are all different things that identify us as human beings, right? And like all of you guys said, this is not something that has always existed, right? This understanding of this being a human being is somewhat of a modern explanation of what a human being is, right? Do you guys think that maybe 300 years ago they knew all those makings of a human being, let alone thousands of years ago, right? This is a question that philosophers have been asking for thousands of years. We said names like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, right? Their entire work of philosophy was based on what are human beings? What is their purpose? What is the end of, why are we here existing, right? And medical progression has got us to the point of, this is somewhat what a human being is, right? If you go to a doctor and you have, if you go to the doctor and say, I have an ear problem, and they start testing your knee for something, you know you probably went to a doctor who's not qualified, right? But maybe a few thousands of years ago, they really didn't know what they were doing. They're kind of guessing and picking, right? So modernity has brought us to this place, right? So this is a good example of what you can identify as a human being, right? And then you can also go to this, right? As we talked about in the main session, what is a human being to us, though? And again, keeping in your mind in the background, why does it even matter, right? So again, look at this photo, discuss between yourselves, compare this photo of you all said this is a human being, compare this human being to what this is showing as a human being, okay? Can you guys do that? Minute or two, discuss.
Yeah, it's great to measure and then
You guys need Bibles to help with your answers? There's Bibles there as well.
What is it about?
That's a good question. What is that like? So to help with the discussions, one of the questions that was posed was, what is that line coming from Jesus to that guy? So that was a question. So if that helps your discussion, throw it in there. If you feel like you have an answer, we can talk about that in a second. Okay, you guys good? Ready to come back to the roundtable discussion? Any thoughts from comparing this photo to this photo?
So, from what I've learned back in Sunday school, this picture is Jesus breathing life onto Adam.
Nice.
And in this, I can, from what I've learned, of course, Adam is made out of dust. And so Jesus is breathing life into him. Whereas in the other picture, it's us humans as flesh and blood, like how Jesus Christ is.
Nice. That was a good example. I like how you compared both of them, right? This is just the human as flesh and blood, right? As materialistic, right? Versus this, you see Christ is giving something to that person that, as the scriptures tell us, is someone made out of dust, right? And have you guys ever had the chance to attend a funeral service?
Yeah.
Do you guys know at the end of service, they'll take dirt and they'll put dirt on the body? And do you know what the celebrant says when he does that? He says, from dust you were created, from dust you return, right? So we have this understanding even in our liturgical practices, right? Man is made out of dust, right? So that was a good point. Anyone else?
Oh my gosh. The first image seemed more empirical, more rational.
Okay.
Like, oh, we're made out of cells make up these other things. The second image is more romantic, more spiritual in nature. They're oh, we're made in God's image rather than small different parts of ourselves, and we're came from Christ himself.
Okay, and you brought up a good point, right? The first one kind of talks about the cells and different anatomical structures, right? Is there anything wrong with those anatomical structures? No, right? And does anyone think the heart is internally bad or the ear is internally bad in and of itself? No, right? But you still have a contradiction of two different pictures, right? Anyone else? No one else? Okay, so the reason I put this photo up here is because what was the question we posed in the beginning, right? Who are you, right? And why does it matter? This picture and this story in the Bible is a great example of giving you the answer of who you are, right? Who am I? I'm going to start with the assumption, instead of when he started in the church, right? I'm going to start with the assumption that we all believe in God, right? And I'm sure at various points in our life, we'll have different doubts, we'll have different questions. We'll maybe step out of the church because we don't feel comfortable with our identity as Christians for whatever reasons, right? Those are all normal parts of life, right? When you look at many of the people in the Bible, they're not people who always have been these people who committed their life to God, right? You guys know that, right? There's many times people in the Bible who lived a life where they weren't living a life which was pleasing to God, right? One example is King David, right? What did King David do, right? We have Psalms 51. What was the purpose of Psalms 51 being created? Do you guys know? Asking for forgiveness. You know for what sins that David did?
Killing his wife's husband.
Yeah, so his wife's husband, right? And even just saying that phrase, it sounds weird because that's what he did. He took his best friend's wife and had him killed so that he could marry his wife, right? And is that a good thing to do? Murder and adultery, right? But, as we just said in Psalms 51, his heart was full of repentance and he turned back to God, right? Because that is him identifying, maybe what I did wasn't who I am, right? Sometimes we identify ourselves, like we said, you said you like art, and you guys said you guys do Bharatanatyam, you guys said you guys do sports, and sometimes we identify ourselves with the actions that we do, right? And sometimes those actions are good actions, sometimes those actions are bad actions, right? But it all goes back to, like Tirumani said, the inner person and the way that we show ourselves outside sometimes doesn't add up, right? Does that make sense? The person that we tell ourselves that we are, the person that we believe that we are, sometimes in our actions, in our thoughts, in the way that we live our life, it doesn't add up, right? But again, going back to that initial question, why does it matter, right? So we're having really good conversation about who I am, who Adam is. Did anyone have any other thoughts about this picture or compared to the other picture? Did you guys figure out what the line is? Are any thoughts on that?
I think the line is basically the breath of life that Jesus blows onto Adam.
Awesome. Yeah, that's right. And again, remember how we just talked about funeral and these things kind of lining up with our liturgical services? Can you guys think of an example of the breath of life being used in any of our sacraments? This might be a little bit of a harder question.
Is it like apostolic succession?
That is one example, and that's the harder of the two answers. Baptism. Great. Those are the two answers. Right? So there's a part during baptism where the Achin or the Tirimeni will blow on the candidate who's being baptized, removing any evil spirits from him. Right? And even during the priest ordination, during the gospel for the priesthood ordination is taken after Christ rises from the dead. You guys know the story where St. Thomas doubts his belief.
Yeah.
Before that, there's a portion where it says, and Christ breathed on them and gave him his peace. Right? And then he breathes on the candidate who's going to become a priest, thus continuing the apostolic succession. Right? So in the same way that God created each and every single one of us and gave us the breath of life, in the church's sacraments, we continue this identity in our baptism, and God willing, if anyone is ordained, right, especially to the priesthood, the succession of the image and likeness of God being given to each of us and identifying it of who we are. Have you guys heard of C.S. Lewis? Have you guys heard of that name? So he's a great writer, a great theologian of the modern centuries, and he once said this quote, so just bear with me, okay? In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurable and superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. I'll say it one more time, okay? In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurable superiorly to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. When you guys hear that quote, what does that make you guys think of? Anybody else? Back row? Girls in the back? Anyone? Any thoughts?
That makes me think that if we think we know something and we don't really know it, then that means we don't know that person at all.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Can anyone speak to the comparison about knowing yourself and knowing God? Why does that matter? And you can use this picture as reference, right?
If we know ourselves, we also know God to a degree, because He made us in His likeness.
Perfect, right? I mean, I appreciate how you said to a degree, right? The quote was basically saying we can never fully know God, and that's the basis and that's the start of wanting a relationship with God, right? You many times, I don't know if any of your friends, or maybe when you guys get older, especially when you guys are in college, you guys will have people who challenge your identity, your faith, right? Based on this understanding of who's God, why does it matter to me, right? And you can get into these long discussions and debates about, oh, God is this, God isn't that, God's evil, why does God exist if there's cancer in the world, if there's poverty, all these things, right? But apart from that, the starting point is, I'm nothing in comparison to God, right? Have you guys read the book of Job? Or have you guys heard of the book of Job? Or you guys know what, it's about this man who goes through, the degree of suffering that he endured was immeasurable, right? Because the devil said, what? He only likes you because he has a good life right now. And God said, okay, put him to the test. And he challenged him in every aspect that members of his family died. He was diseased. He went through this horrible treatment of life, right? And he questions God. And he says, why is there suffering? And God gives him a second to, kind of see the fullness of what the world is, right? We have a very narrow view of the world, right? If I asked you guys, how many people do you know in this world? You can probably use your Instagram following as like a base reference, or TikTok followers. What's the average amount of people you guys know? I'm assuming no one has 1 million followers here, right? Does anyone have 1 million followers on any subscription site on Instagram or TikTok? No? Okay, thousands maybe, right? When you talk about family, people at school. But typically, the amount of people that we know is in the hundreds, right? And how many people are in the world? Billions. 8 billion, I think, is the number currently, right? So when we think about the people that we know and the life we know and the perspective of life we know compared to life in general, right? When we think about humanity in general, right? Like I said, we all have identifying characteristics which are good. I'm not saying any of those things that you guys identified yourself as liking Bharatanatyam, liking art, liking volleyball, soccer, whatever it is. Those are not bad qualifying characteristics of who you are, right? And as you guys know, as times change, you know, you might identify yourself. The way people identified themselves in the 1700s versus now is very different, right? For example, racial, like ethnicity, right? Until maybe whenever slavery kind of stopped, you kind of had a segregation of people based off of race, right? As Christians, we can all answer, I hope, pretty easily, was that a good thing that you had a separation of people? One person is better than another person because of their skin color? No, right? You have different identifying qualities of human beings at various different points of society and time, right? But to figure out who the person really is, it's not about, you know, in this individual moment, who you are. It's not about individualistically about what sport I like or what I like. Sometimes, I mean, I'm sure you guys know, right? The world is very divided. Do you guys agree?
Yeah.
Do you think the world is more united or divided when you take a very broad look?
Divided.
More divided, right? Even the political party, right? For any of you who care about history, the fear of the founding fathers of America, do you know what one of their biggest fears was for the political system of America?
Two-party.
A two-party system. When I ask you what are the two parties in America, what do you guys say? Right? That was their fear, to have this thing happen, and it happened, right? And based on that, the world is so divided. That's in this country, right? In India, I don't know much about India politics, but I always hear my uncle say BJP something and something else, right? So the world's constantly divided, right? And sometimes it can be about bad things, right? It can sometimes be about sports. I came in and said Detroit's better than Chicago, right? That could be a harmless little thing, but in other respects, it can be something bad, right? So we have to understand what unites us, not just everyone in this room, right? Like we said, we call our church Indian Orthodox Church. Does that mean only Indian people are supposed to come to our church? No, right? Our church is apostolic, it's universal, it's Catholic. What does the word Catholic mean? I just said it. Universal. It's open for everyone. When we say Indian Orthodox, all it means is that Baba Tirumani is from India, because St. Thomas brought the gospel there and we have apostolic succession through St. Thomas. Besides that, it doesn't matter, right? You guys, the girls wear churdars to church, the guys, I'm sure every once in a while you wear a jubba when your parents force you to, right? Those are cultural identifying factors of you being an Indian. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying you should burn your jubbas and churdars. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying we have to understand more than that, right? If someone who's not Indian walks in our church, are we going to look at him and be like, oh, who's this guy? Like, who told him to come here? They don't belong here. Or are we going to welcome them in and say, oh, they are a human. They belong to be here because they desire a relationship with God, right? Then when he posed the question, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship, right? And obviously, if you want to argue about definitions, yes, it's a religion. No one's arguing that. His point was that the basis of the religion of Christianity is established in what? Having a relationship with
God.
With God. Specifically who? Who came down? Which? Jesus Christ, right? God. He became incarnate for what purpose? For the purpose of salvation for each and every single one of us, right? Do you guys have any questions so far? No questions? So again, going back to that C.S. Lewis quote, he kind of talks about this immeasurable reality of who God is, right? And sometimes, you know, myself, when I hear this, I'm like, man, church is kind of harsh. Church kind of sucks, telling me I'm like useless and nothing, right? Do you guys get that feeling sometimes? And you can be honest. Sometimes, like, for a Protestant coming to our church and they hear Kuriya some 500,000 times, they're like, why are you saying Lord have mercy this many times? Like, what did you do wrong that badly that you need to just ask God for mercy this much? Right? Isn't that a realistic question that someone who's not Orthodox might have coming into our church? But why do we even say Lord have mercy? Is it because we hate ourselves and God tells us we're stupid people? No. It's because what? We recognize how great God is. Right? It's not about, sometimes we have this misunderstanding of humility. Humility means, oh, cover yourself in dirt and die. That's not what it means. Humility is a recognition of how great God is, right? And in part of that, sometimes, yes. Do you guys know what the root of humility is? It's a bigger word in English. Humble. That's a good guess. That's many times the guess people will go with. But a more harsher word when you think of humility. Humiliation, right? What does it mean to be humiliated? To be embarrassed, right? And so do you guys see that there's a parallel? There's like they're opposing things that I'm talking about, but they come together. Do you guys see that they come together? And I hope I'm not just telling you two opposite things and you think I'm crazy. There's many things in our church where there's a dynamic balance of things, right? You have one thing and you have another thing, right? Diribini talked about us, our desire to be with God, wanting a relationship with Him. But what did he start off by saying? He said, "Can you guys smile?" Right? There's a balance of these things, right? We have Easter, we have Christmas, but what always precedes those things? What precedes Easter? 50 days.
Good Friday.
There's Good Friday, but 50 days of Lent. For Nativity, for December 25th. What precedes that? Lent. 25-day Lent. Why? Because there's a balance of things in life. Does that make sense? If you're constantly doing things that are always up here elevated, do you realize that takes away that understanding of these things are good? And you need that balance, right? Does that make sense? God is good. And that's a good question, right? Has anyone ever asked you guys, why is there evil in the world? Or is that a question that you guys have posed? If there's a loving, merciful God, why is there evil in the world? Have you guys posed that question to yourself or thought about that at all?
Yeah.
That's a really big question, and a really big question that draws people away from God, actually, right? Because they see suffering, they see poverty, they see people dying, and they're like, if God's real, He wouldn't allow this to happen, right? And that's a completely wrong understanding of who God is, right? If you have something that is good, that is great, then you recognize everything else that's fallen away. Does that make sense? If you have the best biryani without raisins in it, without those little dots that everyone hates. I don't know what they're called. Anyone know what they're called? Yeah, someone said. I think someone said. Cardamom. Yeah, those things that if you bite it like ruins the whole thing. If you have a great biryani and then you have a biryani that has like apples in it and raisins in it, you recognize what's good and what's bad, right? In the same way, you have God who is good and eternal and loves everything and is the source of all goodness, right? When we looked at the human body, what did you guys say? Were any of those things bad in and of itself? No, right? Is anything in creation bad in and of itself? No. Why? Because God created it with love. Does that make sense? But yes, when humans stray away, bad has come into the world. When we constantly turn away from God, bad enters into the world, right? Because we have the choice to make decisions, right? That's not God allowing those things because He hates us. He's allowing those things because it's a recognition of there's a difference between good and bad. Does that make sense? Do you guys have any questions? Nothing at all? Okay, we can end there. We'll start tomorrow, continuing on this Genesis story, kind of understanding who the human being is, right? Understanding why, when we ask the question of identity, when we ask the question of who are you, you should always look back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right? Cool? Any questions? No, awesome. You guys are great. Thank you. So tomorrow, I'm sure